Deborah is a two-time Olympian at Athens in 2004, where she came 13th, and Beijing in 2008 Olympics, where she was a finalist, placing 6th, a 5-time Commonwealth Games representative and medalist. 2002 in Manchester, where she got 3 silver, 2006 in Melbourne, where she got gold. In 2010 Delhi Games, she got bronze. In 2014 Glasgow, she got 4th. And on the Gold Coast, she came 4th. And a 7-time World Championship representative. Deborah was the first woman inducted into the Australian Weightlifting Federation Hall of Fame. Deborah was a director of Australian Weightlifting Federation for 5 years and is the only Australian weightlifter to compete at 5 Commonwealth Games. And in the entire Commonwealth, only one other person has equalled that representation. But she's not just an athlete. She completed a double degree in law with honours and criminology, and a criminal justice degree on sports scholarship with Griffith University, where she was recently inducted into their Sports College Hall of Fame. Deborah is a nationally accredited mediator and is undertaking her Masters in Teaching and Learning. Please welcome Deborah Ackerson.
Thank you. That was quite an intro. My usual talks are inspirational and motivational for usually a group of school students, so let's see how we go today. I have such respect for strong women, and right down there, very strong woman, Kiralee, such respect. Okay, I want to start with my PhD sister, who I was reading through this last night with, told me it's not a quote, it's an excerpt, because it's long, and I'm sorry, it's a page long, but it's really interesting. Don't know if that's happening behind me. It's from a presentation by Play by the Rules Australia, who in 2021 partnered with the federal government department called Sport Integrity Australia to combine national online training programs. So many of these programs are to be completed by clubs or associations or even athletes as part of their relevant, say, sporting agreements. Okay, this is the quote. Sorry, excerpt. I think before we begin any meaningful discussion about transgender or intersex inclusion in sport, we really have to just take a step back and reflect a little bit on the assumptions that we have about sex and gender in general. I think these are concepts that we tend to take so much for granted that we rarely ask ourselves, what is it that we mean by them? We assume, for example, that all people can be categorised completely, neatly, as either a man or a woman. And that just isn't true. So instead of thinking about sex and gender like two completely separate, discrete boxes, it can be really helpful to start thinking about biological sex characteristics, gender and gender presentation as 3 quite separate continuum like this. We all have biological sex characteristics, and it's true that most of us would be located at either end of that line, but there is a whole range of people who, for a variety of reasons, find themselves somewhere much towards the middle. And it goes on. So what's that all got to do with sport? Which I ask myself. In a sporting context, participation is almost exclusively segregated by sex. And we just tend to assume that it's always going to be completely self-evident about whether someone should compete in the men's competition or the women's competition, but we're not very clear on which criteria or which group of criteria we might rely upon in order to make that assessment. And it goes on. When the reality of someone's biology, gender identity and gender presentation doesn't fall neatly at the extremities of that sex-gender continuum, what is it that sport actually means when they say woman or man? Do you mean my biology? Which bits of it? My chromosomes, my genitals? What if I'm a person who has chromosomes that are neither XX nor XY? What if my ID documents show my sex differently to the way that I identify and present? What if my ID documents show that my legal sex is neither male nor female but X? I'm pretty confident that even those of you who have a policy on this stuff would really struggle to articulate clearly how that policy would apply in each of those situations. And the point here is not that we should do away with sex-segregated sport. The point is that when we choose to make a particular competition sex segregated, we need to be really clear about why. There's unfortunately no universally right or wrong answers to these questions. It's a really tricky situation. End of excerpt. Okay, so I've been training as an athlete in sport since I was 14 years old. 20 years of my prime years training and competing at the elite level representing Australia in multiple sports, athletics, third in the world as a 15-year-old discus thrower, national level track cycling and rugby, played for Queensland and was selected for Australia. But my main love of sport, which of course is Olympic weightlifting. So right when I started Olympic weightlifting at the age of 14 in 1998, it had just been announced that the vote had been carried, not unanimously, mind you, that women finally had the right to compete in the sport of weightlifting at the Olympic Games level for the very first time. And this was for the Sydney 2000 Olympics. Men had been competing in the sport since its inception as a foundation sport at the modern Olympics since 1896. So, 104 years for women to wait to compete at the Olympic Games, and I believe it was about 3 Olympics later that we had males competing in the female category. 52 years for women to compete at the Commonwealth Games in weightlifting. I was a member of that first women's team that got to compete at the Commonwealth Games in Manchester 2002. And 5 consecutive Commonwealth Games later, I compete against a male at the Gold Coast in 2018. And that's why I'm talking to you here today. So initially, when this male athlete wanted to compete in the female category, the only requirement was that he have a GP sign off a gender medical certificate to confirm that he was going to be a female from here on in, get a new list of ID documents, and serve 12 months of not competing, but being available for drug testing, whereby his testosterone levels needed to be below this magical number that was plucked out of the air of 10 nanomoles per litre. Once this 12-month period was complete, the athlete, a biological male, could now compete in the women's category. Please note that the average elite female athlete's testosterone level is between about 0.8 and 1.3. So since the 10 nanomoles per litre, random number that came out of nowhere, it's been reduced for a lot of sports down to 5 and even down to 3, which is still about 3 times your average elite female. There was no requirement for any physical changes to take place for that male athlete to compete in the category. So this male athlete began to transition at the age of 34 after breaking national records as a junior male athlete, was the oldest ever athlete to debut at Olympic Games in a foundation sport at the age of 43, and yet went into the Tokyo Olympics as a real medal contender in the female category. Fairness underpins all sport. So the following are just a few reasons why having biological males in the women's category is unfair. And I know that some of you are probably sitting there going, yeah, I think this all makes sense. I feel silly sometimes actually having to state the obvious, but here we go. You might not be able to read that, but I'm going to go through it anyway. 66% on average, males have 66% more muscle in the upper body than women. So 66% more upper body muscle than women in the upper body, and 50% more muscle mass in the lower body than women. So broader shoulders, larger hands and feet, which is on average an advantage in sport. Particularly in weightlifting, you might not think of it this way, but when you have a larger surface area with bigger feet, you can actually push through a larger area to lift the weight off the ground. Larger hands to grip the bar better. And research and scientific testing and everything has shown that grip strength is something that never changes when a male testosterone level drops, with the idea of transitioning. So grip strength, of course, is pretty important for some sports, particularly weightlifting. Men have a larger heart, can pump more blood around the body, particularly the lungs and body tissue, to oxygenate, which helps them to train at a higher and more intense physical rate. Bigger, stronger bones, larger skeletal structure to hold more muscles, which obviously gives an advantage, and longer bones also give better leverage. So men on average are taller, which is an advantage in most sports, and higher hemoglobin levels that I just mentioned to oxygenate the muscles a lot better. You probably don't think of it until you are going as hard as you can up the hill on a fixed wheel bike. and you can't breathe and you just wish that you could get more oxygen to your muscles. Men have a greater amount of fast twitch muscle fibres, which give explosive power. Power is strength plus speed. So if you're fast and you're strong, you're powerful. Speed is another element that has been shown to never reduce. For a male, that reduces testosterone with the idea of trying to transition. That's half of what power is speed. So there's a very interesting website, which is called Boys vs. Women, and it shows performances in the US by high school boys in 2016. And it compares it to the 2016 female Rio Olympians. And I just looked at the 100, 200, 400 and 800 metre running events. And I also looked at 50, 100, 200, 400 freestyle swimming. When you compare all those times, our US high school boys get the top 8 places in every single one of those. Our Olympic women, the world record holders, so the world records for Olympic women were beaten by, you can see that where the yellow is, so that's the average age, that's the age in which the boys beat the women with those Olympic world records. So in the 100 metres he was 15, a 15-year-old beat the Olympic record holder for the women. 14 for the 200, 14, so the average age is about 14, but in some of the longer races it gets to an 18-year-old. So it reminded me of the years that I spent training in the gym, watching these schoolboys come in to start training. I was the best female weightlifter for quite a few years by that stage in the gym. And after months of some of these high school boys coming in and training, they were already lifting sometimes comparable weights to what I was lifting. And it was demoralising, except for the fact that I could tell myself biological differences matter. So for 21 years I was drug tested to ensure that I was not cheating, not drug taking, not doping, which in a power sport is usually to test for testosterone, anabolic steroids and the like. So it makes recovery between your training really good. You don't just suddenly have testosterone and you wake up in the morning and you're Arnold Schwarzenegger. It actually allows you to train harder and day after day after day heavy training instead of needing a rest day in between. So as an elite athlete, the drug testing that I underwent was regular urine tests and blood tests, both in competition and out of competition, during training and sometimes at my home, with no notice given. So being an elite athlete at a certain level, I had to submit paperwork to the Australian Sports Anti-Doping Authority where I would guarantee my whereabouts for 1 hour every single day, and I had to submit that for 3 months in advance. And I remember having to write down my location of my honeymoon, just in case. That would have been a bit of a side, I can tell you now. So I'm explaining the following details to really highlight what I was required to do as an elite athlete to ensure that I wasn't cheating, so to ensure the competition was fair. So for those of you who don't know what a drug test is, it's not like a work drug test, I can tell you that now. So in the sporting world, the athlete passes the urine from their body into a beaker, which the athlete holds, with a designated drug tester of the same sex watching within 1 to 2 metres away from the athlete, watching that stream of urine leaving the athlete's body and going into the cup. Sorry, I'm not trying to gross anybody out, but people cheat when you don't get to see it properly. So the athlete is to be unclothed from the top of the stomach at least and down to at least the knees to allow for an unobstructed view. Why did I do this for 21 years? Because I can tell you now the conversations are quite funny when you're trying to let go while someone's watching you and you're talking about your study and your children and all that sort of thing. I did this for 21 years to ensure a fair competition. I did it because I needed to prove that I didn't have an unfair advantage over my competitors. So how do you think it felt when I lined up against a biological male to compete at the Commonwealth Games, 6'1", 142 kilos? You can imagine my upset, my frustration, my confusion, my feeling of injustice. All the physical advantages that I just said, the biological benefits, together with the testosterone levels upwards of 10 to 30 times that of an average female. It just did not make sense. This could never be a fair competition. I don't know if I've got the right one. So one thing that testosterone provides, so it's not only the ability, as I mentioned, to train longer, harder and more often for bigger, stronger, faster muscles, but the number of myonuclei, strands of muscle fibre within the muscles actually increase in number and it's permanent. It never goes back. It's an irreversible change. That's why some years ago the IOC brought in life bans for repeat offenders, because the athlete would sometimes be willing to dope once to have that irreversible advantage. So you can see that graph of the testosterone levels of male and female, and you can see that little first section is during pregnancy. So this little guy in here is now 3 times that of a female baby, and it absolutely just jumps between the age of 10 and 20. So I'm explaining that about the testosterone because males have elevated testosterone much higher than women, and it occurs naturally, which gives significant physical advantage. But the assumption that lowering that testosterone will suddenly create fairness or a level playing field just isn't true. And one last significant factor, which is not often discussed, particularly by men, the menstrual cycle of a female athlete is incredibly taxing on the body. I went to a round table with a government department, and not one person mentioned that. And because I was the elite athlete, that's what I started to talk about. So most studies have looked at, now there's finally been more studies to look at how a female training program has to change, to be modified to cater for this. It's taken a long time to get to that point to actually acknowledge that it needs to change. There's an increased risk of injury during training, during your menstrual cycle, apart from psychological factors, which I think is always males' fault anyway. There's laxity of joints, which makes them looser and stretchy, and it causes slower athletic speed. So lower back pain and joint pain is also common. But in my sport, all of us had to have at least 3 days and sometimes a week of modified training to cater for this. So 1 week out of every 4 weeks. When you look at an Olympic build-up for 4 years, that is 1 year out of every 4 years that a male will never have to be affected by. And so why am I speaking about this? I'm not competing anymore, obviously. I decided to finish, actually, the day that I found out that I could no longer aim for the World Masters record due to the transgender athlete increasing it by about 20 kilos on each lift. That was when I decided I've got no other reason to lift anymore. It wasn't my children, because I competed at Commonwealth Games after my first 2 girls. But I'm here because I know how hard I worked to be recognised as an elite athlete in what was for a very long time a male-dominated sport. How hard I trained to improve my weights year after year, and to know firsthand how unfair it felt to stand up and compete against a transgender athlete, a biological male at a home Commonwealth Games in front of my family and friends. And I don't want other women and girls to experience this unfairness. So when I think of the future of women's sport, I'm thinking of your daughters, and I'm thinking of my daughters who are going to be elite athletes. My husband said I've got to be careful when I say that, because people think I'm joking, because I'm really not. So I'm worried about their ability to compete in a fair competition. I'm deeply concerned about sports camps, change room facilities, where parents are not told and may not even be aware of a boy, a transgender athlete, in the team with the girls, regardless of whatever age we're talking about. Why do we have separate boys and girls races at school carnivals? For fairness. Why do we have Olympic competitions with men's and women's categories? For fairness. A female that pursues competitive elite sport is not competing for fun. We want to win. And including trans athletes means most of the time that women won't win. Women do not train for years and years to lose. It's about winning. We don't race to come second at the finish line. We race to touch the wall first, to lift the biggest weight, to jump the highest, etc. Our goal is not to come second in an unfair competition. When you line up in a race that you know is unfair, it is very hard to give it everything. Girls and women will settle with losing and not try, or perhaps just stop playing sport altogether. So for the last 6 years, I've been repeatedly asked, how did I feel competing against a transgender athlete? When I was asked by the media at the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games repeatedly how I felt, I was very strongly advised by all the team management not to say anything, or to at least be extremely careful with what I said. So the first time that I researched, First time I researched the history of transgender athletes, quite some years ago, I found a lot of information about intersex athletes. So you've probably heard about the South African female runner who had naturally elevated testosterone levels, equivalent to a man, but was raised as a girl and for all appearances was a female. Didn't know anything about the high testosterone levels until she was actually drug tested, and then questions started to get asked. So she was told she would have to lower her testosterone levels in order to compete in the female competition. Intersex is known as disorders of sex development, and it's a natural occurring and variety of congenital conditions. So around that time, there was a group of transgender athletes who were asked to write a paper for the International Olympic Committee on transgender and the inclusion of transgender athletes in sport. And I believe there was about 4 athletes that were in that study. So they were effectively just joined in. Transgender and intersex athletes were joined under the one sort of policy and everything. They're not the same class of athlete. Transgender being suddenly included meant that without really any significant studies or research or anything, suddenly biological males were competing in the women's category. So Sport Australia, so what's our situation right here, right now? Kiralee mentioned a little bit before. But Sport Australia is the source of our guidance and direction here in Australia. That was where sort of the quote was coming from. They're sort of along the same lines there. The National Sporting Organisation has policies which Sport Australia... the National Sporting Organisations have policies that adhere to Sport Australia. So when a Sport Australia says these are just guidelines, sports to get their funding have to follow guidelines and procedures. And they all filter down to state organisations and to your local sporting clubs. So under the Federal Sex Discrimination Act, you can't be discriminated against in relation to your gender identity, and all sports must accept membership and allow transgender persons to compete and train and access bathrooms and change rooms, whichever gender they choose. But there's a permanent exemption, and that's the competitive sporting activity, where only in any competitive sporting activity where strength, stamina and physique of the competitors is relevant can you discriminate. So none of those words that are quoted there, competitive sporting activity, strength, stamina or physique, was actually defined by the Act, which is really helpful. But the Federal Court did approve on the fact that the exemption will operate if, when both sexes compete against each other, the competition would be uneven because of the disparity between the relative strength, stamina and physique of male and female competitors. I just can't think of a sport where you do not require strength, stamina and physique to the point of disparity between sexes. So, Sport Australia is right now drafting their transgender inclusion policies guidelines for sport. The IOC took a very long time to come back with their inclusion framework, and when it finally came out in November 2021, so remember everyone was sort of in bated breath waiting with the Tokyo Olympics what was going to be happening. But then they emphatically stated that it was not going to be binding. This is just to help the international federations, to give them some framework and guidelines. So the IOC said they couldn't possibly provide a one-fits-all approach. Every sport is different. Every sport should develop their own guidelines and policies with their own eligibility criteria based on their own evidence and their own data. But you've got to make sure you're not discriminatory when you do it. Do it fairly. So just all the points. They're the points that the IOC came back with the framework. And the number one goal is inclusion. Number one. Now, they distinguish between grassroots community sport and elite sport. I don't know of any female athlete that just dropped into elite sport. Everyone comes from some sort of grassroots sport. Prevention of harm. This is not the women getting tackled on a football field. This is about the psychological harm of a transgender athlete not included into their preferred category. Not discriminatory, fairness, no presumption of advantage of transgender athletes. You need to have evidence to prove that. And meaningful stakeholder consultation with transgender athletes. So the IOC is basically, I did this little graph, don't get confused because it's very simple. There's numbers. The IOC sent the issue back. Okay, so we've got the sporting clubs saying what's going on. State organisations, national goes to Sport Australia or international, and then they go, right, international committee, what am I going to do? They send it back and go, it's up to the international federations, so you guys sort it out. So it provides a lot of answers, which is really good. And as we've heard, there are some national sporting organisations that, although they have to follow guidelines of complaint handling processes, with Sport Australia, they don't. I was writing policy for our national sport for three or 4 years, and it sort of all happened before this all happened. So one thing I did forget to mention is that the sporting activity exemption does not apply for under 12-year-old sport. So up to 12, anybody can go into any category that they want. My oldest daughter is 11 and she just went to the National Judo Championships last year. This hasn't come up as an issue yet, but, yeah, we'll see. So to conclude, our world is broken. It's in God's hands when that's going to change. And injustice, unfairness, bad laws and policies, they're all just signs of the broken world that we live in. As a Christian, I want to be kind, I want to be loving, and I want to be patient to everyone. Kind in Kirrili's sense of kind, and loving in Kirrili's sense of to be a light and a good example to others. And I want everybody to play sport. I want everyone to have the ability to compete at the highest level of sport if they choose and if they can. I want... but the competition must be fair. Fairness underpins all sport. Where do we go from here? People will not believe that this is an issue. And it was only the people that I personally spoke to in the lead up to the Commonwealth Games who just looked at me and could not understand and could not believe that I was going to be competing against a male athlete. There's something called the pub test, and you ask people. Yeah, it's a good one. We need to have the courage to speak up with grace and truth when there is clear injustice with policies and systems. To talk about it, speak your concerns, because ignoring it will do nothing and will change nothing. And it's not a topic that I ever thought I'd be talking about. It's not one I particularly like talking about, but I'm doing it because of my lived experience of what I have been through. And I can tell you now, in the lead up to the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games for over a year, every week we were getting updates on what was going to happen and what policies were changing and it literally came to the day where I saw the athlete going to weigh in and I thought, I cannot believe we're at this point. I was just it was shock. I had to really refocus when I was warming up. And then I realised, I know why this is happening. I was injured, I didn't get in the category that I wanted to get into, and so I was in this category against this athlete. And I knew that was God, so I didn't fight it, and I knew what I was going to need to speak about in the coming years. So I've experienced the injustice, and I don't want future generations of female athletes to be lost. I want my daughters and your daughters to compete with fairness. Thank you.